Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Voting for Our Future, a discussion of some of the most critical issues that many would say have not been adequately addressed during the municipal elections. I'm Pam Sugerman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which TMU is situated. We are on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. I offer this land acknowledgement not simply as a performative act, but as symbolic of a much more concrete, meaningful, and transformative project that involves the recruitment and retention of Indigenous faculty, the reimagining of much of our curricula, methodological assumptions and pedagogical approaches, and the opening up of space for Indigenous education generally through the work of the Yellowhead Institute, which is housed in the faculty. Democratic dialogue and the complex relationship between democracy, public policy, governance, and social inequality is something that we seek to explore in the Faculty of Arts. We recognize that when there is space for the voices of the many diverse groups that make up the city, when more people join the conversation, we come closer to effecting meaningful change, transformative change even. A more inclusive democracy is one of the goals of the Democratic Engagement Exchange under the able leadership of Executive Director John Beebe. An engaged democracy, says John, requires that voters go into elections with the information they need in order to make meaningful choices for the future. And since debates in the current municipal election cycle have been limited, we're taking this opportunity to expand the conversation with three civic leaders, Daniele, Zanotti, Debbie Douglas, and Kofi Hope. Daniele Zanotti is president and CEO of the United Way Greater Toronto. And in this role, he witnesses and works to address the many challenges and issues facing Toronto residents, including homelessness, mental health, and inequality. Debbie Douglas is Executive Director of the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Through her work in the nonprofit sector, Debbie has highlighted issues of equity and inclusion, including race, gender, and sexual orientation within the immigration system, and promoted the creation of safe, welcoming spaces within the settlement and integration sector. And last but certainly not least, Kofi Hope is co-founder and CEO of Monumental, a strategic advisory firm focused on creating fair and just cities and institutions. Kofi is a longtime community activist and youth advocate, as well as a Rhodes Scholar with a doctorate in politics from Oxford University. Thank you all for joining us today for what will be a compelling and important conversation about the future of our city and about its impact on our lives. And I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator for the evening, though he probably needs no introduction. I think many of us listen to him every morning. Ismaila Alfa is host of CBC Metro Morning and is steeped in stories of our city. We're so grateful that you've been able to join us and make time out of your busy schedule to participate in this conversation, especially knowing that you have a very early start tomorrow morning. Please join me in welcoming Ismaila to the virtual stage.
Thank you very much. And I actually really appreciate being involved in this conversation. Events like this, conversations like this are a great way, a very important way for me to learn more and more about this city that I now live in. If you do know our show and who I am, I've lived in Toronto for just over 2 years now. And it's interesting, given what we're going to be talking about today. About 4 years ago, before I even thought about taking or getting a job here, I was in town filling in on the very show that I host now. And I was speaking with my best friend, and he'd been living here since about 2003, 2004. And he said something to me that I didn't quite get when he said it. He said, man, we were talking about the idea of me moving to Toronto and wanting to bring my family here. He said, you know, it's a shame that it's taken until now for you to try and make that move, because when I moved here, this was a city you could move to in order to make it. And now this is actually a city that you have to make it in order to move to. And like I said, it didn't quite click for me when he said it to me at the moment. I thought, whatever, I'm going to move forward and figure out how I get to Toronto. Well, I got here, and I moved here right when the pandemic hit, like right after the pandemic had hit. Talk about probably the worst time to move to any city, because you can't really see what that city has to offer. But what I did see was how this gap he'd been describing between the haves and the have-nots, that gap was growing, and the speed with which it was growing had been accelerated by this pandemic. Now, again, this is a gap that was growing prior to the pandemic, but I watched it speed up after I got here, and I was hit right away with some of the issues that we're going to discuss here. Looking for a place to rent for me and my family, one that I could afford that would keep me close to where I would work. I met people who were doing things like working 2 part-time jobs, neither of which gave them sick days, neither of which was stable. And they were doing this all to support themselves and, let's say, a sibling in a small apartment they could barely afford, all while still supporting family back in the country that they had moved from. As many of us who moved to this country have families that are still supporting others back home. So it was obvious to me at that point in time that this is a problem. This issue is very unsustainable for those who aren't in the position of privilege, the haves. So luckily, we have some brilliant minds here to discuss what those issues are exactly, what are some of the big ideas around that. And I feel like I should get right into it with you all, because let's be real, you all are the ones with the great ideas and are seeing things at the ground level that I would really love to learn about here. So I kind of wanted to start with a very broad question for all of you. And we'll start with you, Debbie, if that's okay. This gap that I was describing, that I had seen and noticed it was growing, paint that picture for me as you see it. Where do you see those gaps, and where are they growing quickly?
Thanks for the question. I think what we've seen, and especially since the health pandemic, is a widening of that gap. I think the pandemic really crystallized for us what many of us many of us involved in activism and trying to create this new just society have been saying for decades, that poverty is racialized and becoming increasingly so. And it is also feminized. It is women, it is immigrant women, and it is racialized immigrant women. When the health pandemic first hit, we realized that the folks who didn't have jobs where you could stay home, the folks who had to take public transportation at 6 a.m. in the morning, who were cleaning our hospitals, who were making sure that there is food, who were working in our nursing homes, were recently arrived women, racialized immigrant. Many, as we've come to know, have been here for many years and are undocumented. And so really have no safety net, and so had absolutely no choice. So even when the federal government and other levels of government tried to put income supports and those kinds of things in place, there is a whole group of people who had no access to those social supports. So when we talk about the widening gap and the deepening poverty in Toronto, it is broad, it is racialized, and it is gendered.
Kofi, where are you seeing this gap grow?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with everything from Debbie's analysis. And I'd add, along with it being racialized, along with it falling predominantly on women and newcomers, it's also geographic, right? Mm-hmm. So a big piece, and we see a concentration of this, right? And they have that famous 3 cities report and poverty by postal code that United Way was part of decades ago that kind of raised the flag, but showed, the way in which we once were a city of pretty mixed neighborhoods across the board from north, south, east, and west in Toronto. And over time, what we've seen, and this is like a global trend, right? But a concentration in the core of folks who are quite upwardly mobile. You could call them the creative class or the managerial professional class. The folks who've been winners in the global economy, moving to the most urban parts of the city because of the lifestyle, because of the amenities that are there. Prices rising, and working class folks, racialized folks, newcomers, people of color, increasingly being pushed to what we call the inner suburbs, the parts of the city that were built after World War II, and that are really in those, York, North York, Etobicoke, Scarborough, and the divisions between those parts of the city widening. And those divisions come in a lot of ways, but one of the biggest ones I see and that I've been doing some research and work around is that gap in service delivery.
Yes.
In the fact that we do not see equity in how services are given. And we did a survey in Rexdale and in Scarborough, myself and some researchers at U of T, went on the ground, asked folks about what was going on and what their thoughts were. And like many surveys, their lowest level of trust of any institution was in City Hall, right? Lower than the police, lower than in businesses, lower than federal government was City Hall. And when you talk to people about, well, what's the difference and why don't you feel City Hall cares? But, it wasn't big esoteric things about funding disbursements and this and that. It was, because look at the quality of the infrastructure here. Look at the potholes. Look at our community center, which has mice in it. Look at how hard it is for us to get swimming lessons for our kids. All of these different pieces. And when you move through the city, you see the difference.
Yeah.
And it isn't always a conspiracy, but part of it is our city is built to respond to upper middle class folks and their advocacy, the folks who know how to use 311, write their counselor. Those are the folks who get investments. Those are the folks whose streets get cleaned, and folks who maybe don't have that familiarity with how to make the system work. Their neighborhoods get neglected, the services there continue to kind of degrade in capacity, and that helps fuel this gap, not to mention transit. Those are the folks going to those two jobs are spending hours every day moving back and forth, while we see that kind of creative class downtown, work from home, walk to work, and that makes such a difference in lifestyle and even ability to take advantage of opportunities.
You mentioned the transportation there, and it's interesting you should mention that. Just last week, we heard from a young man on our show who was, while talking with the reporter, calculating how much money he was going to make at his job because he was spending $15 each way to get into work. And he even said, well, that's like an hour and a half of my work done because I've now paid to go into work. Daniele, where are you seeing this gap, and how bad is it getting?
Well, first of all, clearly, Ismaila, your friend read much of the United Way research that has gone on over the last decade, because he articulated quite succinctly for you what's happening across the GTA. And Kofi and Debbie have talked about it as well, that this GTA that was once the city of neighborhoods is increasingly island segregated by income. And what used to be considered a downtown poverty issue started to spread into the suburbs and is now pushing into Peel with about 20% of people living in poverty. And in York region, where in the 80s and 90s, 0% lived in poverty. Today, they're getting close to 10%, with a complete lack of social infrastructure to meet needs in a culturally appropriate way. But for me, as I think about from my position of privilege at United Way and all the power in my role as a white settler and the work I'm able to do working with and in community. If I rewind a little bit to Daniele growing up at Keele and Lawrence, both of my parents, newcomers to Canada from Italy, land, get 2 jobs each right away, and are able to scrimp together a bit of a mortgage to buy a house. We rent the top floor, squeeze every Italian relative we know into the basement. I slowly get access to school, then to a chance to go to university, and then to move into a master's program at U of T and move into this job. That 1970 Toronto is gone. And increasingly, postal code, sexuality, race, immigration status, gender dictate your ability to move up the social ladder. And we saw this loud and clear in COVID, because the GTA COVID hotspot map was the exact same map as poverty by postal code in 2004, was the exact same map of the highest number of emergency visits and chronic diseases, was the exact same map of racialized, precariously employed, underhoused people. And we were all hot about it back then, friends. It was in the headlines, all we were talking about. But in the end, in those neighborhoods, Brampton, North Etobicoke, it was community who came together to solve some of its own issues. It was community who had to lean in with a model where they hired community ambassadors to go knocking on every door in every language imaginable to bring up vaccination rates. And so in the face of this 15-year arc that we've been researching, in the face of what we've just been through in COVID, you would think that the bulk of the conversations about this municipal election, from Mississauga to Markham, right down to Etobicoke, would be about the crisis of poverty in the GTA. But no, every debate is skimming. We're using good language. We're skimming the top. Affordable housing. What the hell does that mean? For those most impacted by poverty, we're not having conversations about deeply affordable housing. We're talking about jobs. Jobs if you've got a university degree and you are living in a home with your parents that you can get to that job. But for most people, that's really far away. And they're working 3 jobs. So we're not having the conversations about the GTA of today. It feels like we're having a 1970 discussion.
You know,
just a 1970s discussion for some people, Daniele, because the 1970 trajectory you described hasn't been true for many folks, right? I'm thinking 1970s, large influx of Caribbean women coming to work as domestic, left their children behind while they took care of Canadian-born children. Children came here, family breakdown, but also supports, but finding racism in schools, kids being pushed out, parents working 3 jobs, right? While trying to juggle and get over many of the stereotypes that their children were facing in school. Some of the same issues that we're seeing here. And for me, those are the issues that are also not being discussed here in the election, right? Who is represented at the table? Who gets to prioritize the issues, Daniele, that you so eloquently talked about?
Now, I do wonder. I mean, all 3 of you brought up some of the same elements that factor into this gap growing very, very quickly, right? Gender, race, geographical location, education. All those sorts of things. The actual structure of your family has effect on that as well. I have found, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I've found when you bring up those topics and then you mention the word politics, most people immediately put up a wall and they say, I have nothing to say about that, or I don't see what that has to do with our municipal election. And I think quite often it can be lost by many what powers the city has to impact your life with those sorts of things. So let's start then with housing here, because that is something that is top of mind for most everyone who lives in the GTA, right? But when it comes to getting housing for those who are unsheltered, when it comes to getting deeply affordable housing, what are you hearing from the people who want to lead the city right now? Is there anything, I see people shaking their heads already. Is there anything you're hearing that gives you hope that there will be progress made by a leader, any leader that gets into power now? Debbie, you were the first one to shake your head, so I'm going to come to you right away.
I was thinking when Daniele talked about them skimming the surface of these issues, that's exactly what came to my head. I must say, cautiously hopeful a few years ago when the city pulled together its housing plan with that Ismaila headed up. I thought we were entering, and at the same time, the federal government came down with its housing strategy. And so there are funds from the federal government. There is a sense that there is some political will at the city of Toronto. And then it seems to have all died away. Certainly, people are talking, as you said, about affordable housing when we have such deep housing. We've missed, I think, feel as if we're missing the opportunity to have a renewed conversation around co-ops and how different groups of people and communities come together and create the kinds of housing that they want. We have an aging population. What are some of the examples that exist internationally in terms of how seniors come together and create communities living in housing that is supportive of each other and that is deeply affordable because they're on a fixed pension income, and not everyone, and very few women I know have CPP plus a private pension. What are we talking about in terms of reinvesting in Toronto community housing? In some of the housing that our community-based organizations are running. We have a growing refugee situation here in the city. Houselessness is one of the critical issues, right? The city is renting hotels so that we're able to house people so that they're not on the streets. Why are we not having these kinds of conversations? And what should we be thinking through? Where are we going to house all of these people, even when we talk about the Greater Toronto and Hamilton and Halton areas as well, right? These are some critical issues that we're not hearing anything about. I think the moment is so ripe, and if only we would have the political will in terms of rethinking how it is that we ensure that we have housing. Every time I walk around my neighborhood in the Dufferin and St. Clair area, and there are all of these new buildings going up, and they're all goddamn condos. While we're seeing a growing houselessness population on Eglinton, as people get pushed out of the downtown, as neighborhoods downtown become more and more gentrified, people are moving up to Eglinton and Oakwood. Right?
And what you mentioned right there is a really important point to kind of go off on as well. The idea that there are many new builds, but you're seeing lots of condos. And we've even talked about this on my program. We know that the ratio's shifting. Renters versus owners, if this not versus, I should say, but renters as compared to owners, that's shifting to more renters. Yes. And the conversation has been greatly about home ownership in this city. So I mean, what's Kofi, is there any big idea out there that you think we should be considering in this city?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it is important to that question about what can any leader do and at the city level, because to be honest, we have a national housing crisis. And the city cannot solve everything. And actually a lot of this is about dollars, right? And we have this, whole fiscal imbalance where the federal government, the province have vastly more resources than the city do. The city can't even take out debt to solve some of these issues. So that we have a very constrained ability of what the city can do. And so solving it is going to require massive investment from the feds, much more, even deeper than their national housing strategy and more effective, and the province. But there are kind of two things that the city controls, right? I don't see them building massive amounts of affordable housing. They just don't have the budget or ability to do it. But there's two things that I think are critical ideas that take a lot of political courage that we haven't seen. And those are around planning and zoning and around development charges. But really quickly, so much of the city of Toronto, right? It remains impossible to build the type of housing we need to meet the housing crisis, as in so many neighborhoods are zoned for single family homes.
Right.
And so it is super easy if you were to buy a house in, I don't know, Debbie and I are in the same area, kind of Dufferin and St. Clair. You buy a house there, you knock it down. It's super easy to take that bungalow, knock it down, and build some monster single family home. But to build a 4-unit rental home that can provide that kind of housing for newcomers, for folks on a lower income, is incredibly difficult and many times impossible because of the rules in place. That's something the city can control and can change today. And people from all levels, from even Doug Ford's Commission on Housing to the most progressive groups, every spectrum has said we need to have more inclusionary zoning. We need to change this. But no one, and certainly not our most likely winner of this election, they've talked about it, but no one has committed to saying, we are going to change this. We're going to make it easier to build because there are so many folks who are existing homeowners who don't want to see it happen. There's so many people who are tied in, as much as we say, oh, the housing crisis, there's a lot of people who benefited from it. If you've had a home and seen it triple in value, right? As much as you say it's a crisis, you're kind of happy about that. Yeah. That is where your investment is. And so anything that says, oh, you're going to add, new basement units, right? Many parts of Scarborough, et cetera, you can't even legally have basement units. And so changing that zoning puts pressure on those existing homeowners who tend to be the ones who call up their counselors, who donate, who vote, and say, you know what, I'd rather have my neighborhood stay as it is. Build it at Yonge and Eglinton, sure, but not here. And we haven't seen a leader with the courage to say, I'm going to change zoning and allow us to build all across the city the housing that everyone needs.
Now, one quick question about that zoning as a solution that we have discussed it. I do wonder, though, you think about that from the perspective of a developer. Oh, all of a sudden, this is zoned differently. Well, I can now buy up 6 houses in this neighborhood, tear them all down, turn them all into 6-unit places. I've got 36 units now, right? And I can charge between $1,500 and $2,000 easily for each one of those units. So how do you ensure that these multiplex buildings, these low rises and multiplex buildings are affordable?
Well, quickly, I'd say 2 things. One, there's supply and demand, that if we get a lot more supply, it will help moderate the prices, but that won't be enough. But the second is that piece I talked about, development charges, right? We put, they say 20% of the cost of new builds is development charges. You can create incentives where you say, if you build affordable housing, we'll waive those development charges.
Exactly.
Right? We can change ways to incentivize the builders to say it makes sense. Or if you build affordable rental, 0 development charges, and we'll speed up your applications. I work with these folks. Time is money for them. If it takes them 3 years to build, they're burning money for 3 years. If you say, you're building affordable housing, we'll let you build it in a year, we'll put it through, they will build it. And so
Debbie,
another thing is control.
And just to pick up on what Kofi was saying, but a key word that Debbie mentioned, which is will. Yeah. Decades ago in the 1970s, the federal government abdicated its responsibility on national housing. We were building at a healthy clip, not perfect, but we were building at a healthy clip. What we're faced with now is decades of all levels of government not leaning into this. And I couldn't agree with Kofi more. At the immediate level, it wouldn't look like an elected official in Mississauga or Markham or Toronto has the power to really open the provincial or federal coffers, but they are tasked as the closest to the community to be the voice of those issues. And so it is their responsibility to lift that up. And during COVID, we saw that a Toronto City Council that prioritized affordable housing for the homeless cut through a lot of bureaucratic red tape, my friend. They found land. They found land that was available, and they could prioritize it for deeply affordable housing. Somehow we started to build modular housing units. Not enough by far, but how did we get to that point? We opened up the wallets of the federal government who were interested. And we're starting to have discussions with the province around deeply supportive housing for those who home ownership may not be on the horizon. So I think part of this is keeping our collective foot on the gas at the municipal level to say, this is a critical issue. And we've left it to become what the local neighborhood wants. And we may only be hearing from a few voices from those neighborhoods as opposed to the collective will of people. But we're allowing it to happen at a neighborhood level instead of saying, for the GTA to continue to have the cranes, the highest number of cranes in all of North America, we better have the equal and proportionate amount of affordable housing for those people who are going to have to work the construction jobs, make sure the coffee is ready in the morning, be driving our TTC buses, and be PSWs for our grandmas as well.
Yeah. And I'm glad that that's where you took it, because that brings us to our next critical issue that I really wanted to discuss here. I know that, Debbie, you brought this up from very early on, the idea of jobs and precarious work out there. We've had many discussions on my program, just in life with people about early on in the pandemic, we know in long-term care homes, PSWs, in situations where they would be working in in multiple homes. And I think at first when it was brought up that this was happening, it was almost vilified PSWs until people start to realize that they're doing this because they need to do this in order to take care of their families and to take care of themselves and to actually have a life where they can eat and have a roof over their heads. But it's not the only type of precarious work, right? I ride to work in the morning, every morning at 3:45 with an Uber driver. And about 90% of the time, that driver is someone who's recently moved to this country, sometimes just bought that vehicle as soon as they got here because they need to get their license and start driving for Uber to make a living because they can't do what they went to school for in Pakistan or in Chad or wherever they came from. Yeah. So where does the city's power, where does their strength come? What can the city do when it comes to work, precarious work, of which, as you pointed out, many people, because of their gender or their race or their geographical location, struggle further? What can the city do here?
City can't set minimum wages, but the city spends billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure spending. And it goes back to what Kofi was talking about in terms of community benefits, right? If the city has a good vendor policies, so that the city is saying two things. They're saying when we go out to market, we will ensure that as diverse a group of people as possible is able to bid and be able to get some of these contracts. That we will have conditions in place that whoever gets the contracts is hiring in the communities where the build is happening, and is paying particular attention to groups who have high unemployment rates, who have been left out historically. So good employment equity policies in place through community benefits. Developers, in order to get this contract, these are the conditions that you must meet. Not only training, although training is important, but well-paid, decent work in construction, in management of projects, in design, in all of these areas. We have kids who we have told, go to school, get a college education, get a university degree, and then they come out and they can't get hired. So those are some of the kids, newcomers, yes. And many of those newcomers who came in and bought a car, they're also doing school at night, right? To catch up, to get recertified in a work that they've been doing for years and years and years. So while the city can't address things like credential recognition, can't set minimum wage, they can certainly use their own budgets as a way to ensure good quality jobs that the city can provide.
And it just strikes me as you're saying that there are multiple benefits to the work being done by people in the community, right?
Absolutely, a sense of ownership and belonging. You build up the community resources to stay in the community. When you pay people decent work, they spend in their communities, right? They're not going off and buying a boat. They're spending in the community. They're going to local shops. So the money stays in the community, which is how we build up those communities that Kofi talked about in the different parts of the city, especially the Northeast and the Northwest.
Daniele, any thoughts on work and what the city can do to make work more accessible and attainable for people here?
Well, I think, to pick up on Debbie's point, if we were to look at the public-private partnerships that are set across the GTA, and then layer on top of that the number of tradespeople that are retiring over the next 5 to 10 years, we have a pipeline of good paying jobs that the city alone, through community benefits, and we're doing it in Woodbine, we're doing it along the Eglinton Crosstown. So this is not new, but if they could embed this as a percentage into all of their own public-private partnerships, we would be well on that journey. I think they also have to play a role in lobbying for living wage. So we still have 1 in 3 workers in Toronto who are making $16 an hour, when we know the living wage in the GTA is probably closer to $22.50. And so even if they cannot be the decider on that factor, a mayor and council across the GTA who comes out strong to local businesses has pure clout to be able to make this a priority to do business in this place?
Kofi.
Yeah, and so I think adding to that idea around social procurement and community benefits, other things that the city controls, to what we talked about earlier, transportation, right? Part of being able to access a job has to do with being able to get there in time, to be able to have some time for your family, for sleep, for the things we need for our mental health. And when you're in neighborhoods where you're having to take multiple buses to get to where you're going, it really reduces your options around work and gives a lot of power to employers and less incentive for them to produce decent work. And so I think we're finally seeing some investments around transportation for areas that have been left out, right? The Finch LRT is being completed. There's some pieces into Scarborough, but really we took our foot off the gas for almost 2 decades around mass transportation in Toronto, and we have a lot of catching up to do. And I think putting that equity lens to where we build transportation lines, right? I remember David Miller had his plan Transit City. They called for light rail along Jane Street, from Bloor all the way up to Jane and Finch, right? If you ride, I used to work at Jane and Finch, I'd ride that 36 Jane bus, it would be packed to capacity with folks, right? Yeah. And it still is, it's only increased. Like these are places that need to be prioritized for transit. It's great we have the Ontario line going downtown, but really, transit that can reach these communities helps create economic opportunities. The other piece is the supports. I ran a charity for many years focused on Black youth, the C Center for Young Black Professionals. And we did workforce development. And we saw from that, getting somebody a job is one thing, but many people, because of issues in their family, because of trauma, because of experience with conflict with the law, all sorts of other pieces, you get the job, but keeping it is an issue. And so we're doing this thing called wraparound supports. We'd get a young person in a job, we'd realize that's only half the way. We had to give them supports to get the stability in life, to keep that job and maintain it. The city delivers Ontario Works, right? Welfare programs. It delivers many supports. And I think really integrating social supports, so we get people who are outside of the job market into work, but give them the support so they can keep those jobs and actually not be jumping from one low-page job to another, but actually building career pathways. Daniele talked about all these jobs in the trades. I ran a trades program. It's great, but you know what, at a trades program, if you show up at the job site 10 minutes late, you're getting fired on the spot.
You're gone.
So people need the support when they're transitioning back in the job market to be able to show up and take advantage of that opportunity. And the city can support those programs which do that.
Well, go ahead, Daniele.
Just a quick pursuit, Ismaila, on the transit thing, because I was struck by a woman in North Etobicoke who has to travel from Rexdale to go into Mississauga for her first job, and then she cuts into Vaughan. That's 3 separate buses. So we talk about this economic engine, and then we have 13 municipal governments across the GTA. We have 3 transit systems with different fares. Could we collectively talk about a fair share that cuts across, so that somebody who's cutting across all of these 3 geographies isn't spending their whole day's pay on our transit system?
Yeah.
That actually brings us right to an area I was curious about hearing from all 3 of you, because you all had mentioned not just race, gender, education, but geographical location. And when we're talking here about transportation and hearing about people going through 3 different municipalities just to get to their 2 jobs, is the city does plan. Has control over planning. Is there a way to better plan this city so that people don't have to stretch themselves to get to work, get to school, get their kids to school, and get all the services that they need, that they could possibly get it in a more of a close in the neighborhood type of way? Is that something that you think could be done in a place like the GTA? Kofi?
Yeah, I think with planning, there's different approaches to it, right? There's a top-down, this idea we can plan the entire city and every part of it and make it work. But you look at, I was reading the other day about Tokyo, right? One of the most successful megacities. There's as many people in Tokyo as are in all of Canada. And in Tokyo, part of the piece is that a lot of the neighborhood planning is dynamic. It's not set by planners. Buildings are torn down and rebuilt all the time. What government focuses on is the kind of arteries, the nervous system of the city, and getting that right, making sure they've got excellent transit connections all across, making sure, you know, they have that sewage infrastructure, those pieces. And so I think, you know, some people would say we can plan it and put the jobs here and there. I think it's focusing on the basics and saying, let's make sure we have that backbone of the city, which is proper transportation. Let's make sure, you know, we have that access to Wi-Fi and to the proper services that folks need, and we'll be able to fill in the blanks. But it's getting, you know, the Star has this great series right now, right? Talking about the fact that we're just not getting the basics right. The article this morning was about potholes.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
We're just not filling in potholes in time. People's cars are getting damaged. It's slowing things down. And so, yes, I think we can, but sometimes I don't think it needs to be someone at City Hall with a master vision of everything. It's saying, here are the core things we need to succeed. Our people are entrepreneurial, they're inventive, they're creative, but we need to provide that canvas through which we can paint that picture of a really dynamic 21st century city.
Isn't active transportation a big part of this as well? Not just like the TTC, but the ability to make your way around this city on a bike or one of the many electric types of vehicles that are out there now that people are using. All I hear from people over and over again is that where there is cycling infrastructure or alternative transportation infrastructure, it's great, but it doesn't always get me to where I need to go. So is that is that an area, is that being talked about enough for you all during this campaign at all?
For me, it's not being talked about it from a safety perspective. So more and more people are getting around, and as you said, more and more of the bicycles and alternative ways of traveling is becoming motorized, which I think is really interesting, given that we're trying to move away from cars. But it's becoming dangerous for folks who are walking on the sidewalk. You know, yes. Speaking as a 6-year-old woman, I asked one of my older friends who lives downtown in a co-op, what's your pressing issue? She said, safe sidewalks. Right? Safe sidewalks. And if we begin to pay attention to things like making sidewalks safe, then it works for everyone. It works for seniors who are pushing their chairs. It works for parents and guardians who are pushing their children in strollers. It works for people with mobility issues and wheelchairs. It works for people who are walking. And so the inner suburbs, many of those streets have no sidewalks. Makes absolutely no sense to me. Right.
That's exactly, Debbie, like when we've been doing work in the Greater Golden Mile that over the next 10 years is destined to have 77 towers, 50,000 people calling it home, 30,000 jobs. And when we asked 1,000 residents what their priorities were, affordable housing, good jobs, and strong neighborhoods with local supports, good sidewalks, access to service. So we brought together a table of residents, agencies, corporate leaders, and 3 departments at the city: economic development, planning, and community services. So when we want to talk about building inclusive neighborhoods, we've got to have these 3 pillars together. Is there good economic opportunities for an entrepreneur in the Greater Golden Mile who might want to start their own business, right through to a company that wants to move there? Do we have a good mix of affordable housing? And are there services close by? And when we've brought in these groups together, already we're seeing the potential of community solutions. We've got a joint construction venture that is 49% owned by Aecon and 51% owned by the community, where all of the hiring for development happening in the Greater Golden Mile is from residents already there. And companies like Ellis Don, the Daniels Group, Enbridge have all committed to hire from this joint construction venture. And so there are potential opportunities even for business that have signed on and committed to procure from the Greater Golden Mile. So there are examples in our own Toronto, in our own GTA that show when we bring elected officials, residents, and community together, we can come up with some real innovation that cuts through some of the bureaucracies and pushes others like CMHC to get involved as well. There's stuff right under our nose, friends. It's that, do we got the will to stay onto that and scale it? Because we are also a city of a lot of pilots. We pilot ad nauseum. Where we've got to grow now is scale this stuff.
Yeah.
We got modular housing. It seems to be working. What are we going to do with the thousands of people who are in our hotels right now over the winter? Where are they going to go when those leases come up? We should be building affordable housing. We should be taking any city land available and building ASAP.
Yeah. Housing and the infrastructure that goes with it. Absolutely.
Are there any other ways that you feel are the next leaders in the city need to move forward as far as making it more livable and affordable for people? I mean, working, the city do things with transportation, city planning has some impact when it comes to jobs, as you were all discussing. Is there anything else out there that would make a big difference in not leaving anybody behind when it comes to the city moving forward? Kofi.
Yeah, well, I think one thing, has to do with entrepreneurship and reducing barriers there. Now, I'll be clear, entrepreneurship is not the best solution to poverty of solutions out there, right?
But this generation is one that's looking to it more and more right now.
But it's part of it, right? Yeah. It's part of it. And it can also be a way that people can subsidize the jobs they have. You can have your side hustle that can help bring income in. And I think part of that is opening up opportunities for that. Like you look at, for example, bring us back to planning, when all of these condo towers are built, right? What do we see at the bottom? We see massive corporations always filling those up. We don't see the small mom and pop stores. We don't see the stores that a newcomer can be family operated. It can build that economic base to send your kids to school. We're getting Shoppers, we get TD Bank. Because the business model, right, is to move into those units, you have to put all the upfront costs to get them ready. You have to put in the HVAC, this and that. And the developers are looking for like big leases. They want to make it simple. And so doing things to require folks to say, actually, we need to see micro units at the bottom of these units, right? We need to see subsidized units for newcomers who want to pilot a business, right? When we think about food businesses, right? Cities all over the world, one of the biggest things that lets them flourish is having really active street food and vendors, right? We've made it so hard. And you heard about, I remember hearing about, Auntie and Jane Finch, who just wanted to show up and boil some corn and sell it and get put in handcuffs by the police, right? That's what happens in this city. Yeah. And so we, and I'm not saying get rid of all the rules, but certainly when it comes to local entrepreneurship and allowing people to put their creativity and expertise in, we have kind of buried people in red tape and regulations. We tried to do food trucks 10 years ago and we had a million rules. You had to buy a $20,000 refrigerated cart. They even wanted you to have, giving your caloric content and letting city councilors decide what's healthy food. Look at New York, look at so many other cities. There are easy ways that we could create opportunities that could let entrepreneurship flourish, because so many people come to this country, aren't able to practice the skills they have, and they get into entrepreneurship anyways. But again, they just find barriers to do that. I think there's really smart ways that we can do that, and it benefits the city. Who doesn't love walking down the street and seeing really creative local small businesses, right? People love that way more than just seeing a Rabba, a Shoppers, a Canadian Tire, right? So it benefits everyone.
Regardless of how many calories.
That's right. Yes, look at things I'm backstopping things like low interest loans or no interest loans for some of these young entrepreneurs and newcomers. I think that's a great idea. I think one of the things that we're also not talking about is issues about who gets to sit around the table. For the first time, we have a number of empty seats. I think it's interesting. I'm paying attention to who the person that we're all expecting to become the leader of the city continues to endorse. You would think that someone who is committed to equity in the city of Toronto and issues of representation, geographically, racially, gender, would be welcoming of opportunities for new people to be stepping up. And instead, we're seeing a real doubling down on those who are not necessarily representative of the priorities of the communities who are most impacted, right? I don't think that poor people, regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation or gender identity or disability, I just lost my train of thought. I don't think they feel listened to. I don't think they feel that their issues are being heard. I think either by the politicians who are running for leadership or by some of us who are activists as well, right?
And I wonder,
it's a very different conversation that's happening between some of us downtown types and the conversation that's happening in some of the areas where my friends and family live.
I'm so curious as to why you all think that is happening. Because what you're describing there is literally what I've been hearing from people I've been speaking with about this election coming up. I don't want to call it disengagement, but it's this disconnect that exists there. And it's not that they don't care about what's happening in the city and in their community. So where do you think, why is that disconnect happening?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but it's also, you look at the changes we've had have not broadened democracy over recent years. They were difficult, right? So we had a city council, which was going to expand, right? Last election cycle. They did deep consultation, we did more. And we had a provincial government which said, no, actually, I'm going to cut the amount of councillors in half. And because, there is that deep distrust in City Hall, people are like, yeah, we don't need so many of them. But what that's meant is councillors now are stretched to double the constituency that they have to represent. And so people are even more disconnected from their councillor because they have twice the amount of residents that they have to support. Now we're moving to the strong mayor system, which perhaps there's some benefits, but really just centralizes power, in the mayor's office. We're not, and these, I'm a political scientist, so these things I like to nerd out on. Many people, their eyes glaze over. But actually the way we construct the system and the way we make more places for people to get engaged and be locally involved helps build trust in it, right? There's like participatory budgeting models we see all over the world, started in Brazil. We actually allow local people to get involved in voting on how spending should happen on infrastructure in their own community. Right now, we have this consultation thing. You put up a sign, you get the same old people. Most of them are older homeowners, predominantly white, show up, give their issues, and the city says, well, we talked to the local people, right? That is not sufficient. It's not working. And it leads to people feeling like these folks don't listen to us. And so democratic reform and opening up the system has to happen.
Well, I keep hearing about that trust, right? And what I keep hearing from people is why that lack of trust exists there. They're saying just that, but they want people to show up physically in their neighborhood. And that's I was Jane and Finch. I was in Little Jamaica. This is even when I was in Scarborough, even in the southern parts of Markham. Everyone I spoke to, when asked what they feel about their vote, would say, I don't feel my voice is heard, and I only see candidates or I only see politicians when it's right before election day. So what has changed, Daniele?
Ergo, the biggest risk we face if we allow this city of neighborhoods to continue to segregate, which is a lack of community. All of our United Way research shows we are losing connective tissue, social capital, it's called in the theories, right? This connective tissue that I trust my neighbors if I need to pop in with my kid or pick up some sugar, or if I'm not feeling well. I trust the neighborhood services around me, and I trust the different levels of government. And research in Toronto, Peel, and York shows that trust and connective tissue is directly correlated to your poverty and your income. And so we have to find meaningful ways to make space at tables for all voices, to engage them in meaningful participatory budgeting or decision-making, and engaging them in the 5 kilometers they care about in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
Debbie, how do you think, what is it going to take what does this next leader of this city need to do to get that trust back of the people of the city?
I think it's around systems change. So I'm not sure one person, and hence my concern around the strong mayor stuff, is that it then takes even more away from council, who's supposed to be representing these very large areas to begin with. I absolutely agree that what we need are different ways for communities to be engaged and to then see their engagement represented in some of the decisions that are being made at City Council, in some of what's been prioritized by the mayor and the mayor's executive, by what money is being spent on. People walk around their neighborhoods, right? People see when their community centers are falling down. People see when sidewalks are cracked. People know that when you have to walk 2 kilometers to a grocery store, or the only thing in your neighborhood is a check cashing place and not a bank. So people see when they're being neglected. And so there has to be a really intentional effort to be working with communities for the city to be speaking to businesses and bringing in businesses, right? TCAC has been going through the revitalization project, starting with Regent Park. I think one of the best things, other than opening up the space in Regent Park, is finally you started seeing street life. You started seeing grocery stores and art and dance and a swimming pool where the kids who live in the neighborhood can have swimming lessons, although they have to continue to fight to make sure that is true. Those things should be happening in all the communities, whether or not we're in North Etobicoke or we're in Malvern, right? Whether or not we're in Western Mount Dennis.
And as concerned as I am, as United Way is about October 24th, and we are, I think we need to collectively say the work is going to be the next 4 years.
Absolutely.
And our ability to build enough civic muscle in the neighborhoods across the GTA, most impacted by poverty, to keep these issues on the agenda. Because if the election is any indication, we're floating up here. And I don't want to look back in 2 years, have this panel and Ismaila asking what's changed, and us looking at each other thinking, oh my goodness, it's gotten worse. We need a dose of civic muscle in the GTA for people to lean into this stuff. And it's going to look, and it needs to look and act and speak very differently than currently. And it needs to address the 3 building blocks that we talked about: deeply affordable housing, good jobs, and building strong neighborhoods wherever the hell you live.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, when you talk about this idea of connection and trust, all the literature says the same thing across the board, that those connections are built when people are able to make casual encounters with their neighbors. Yeah. And when you have, and that's done through social infrastructure, good public services. You know, my kids are in school, you know, because we have a good school in our neighborhood that we go to, that's where I run into other parents. That's where we talk. That's where you learn about activities. That's, you know, the nucleus that grows into that local organizing. When you have a community space where you can have a meeting, whether it's a seniors group coming together or a youth group coming together, you know, when you have a park where you can see the people living in those towers and you're walking your dogs, interact, right? And so that is the kind of platform through which all this connection and trust is built. And we have not been investing enough in quality public spaces, because you can't, again, orchestrate from on top, but you create the platform, people will step into the opportunity.
And we will end it on those very, very strong words. Thanks to all 3 of you for this conversation. This is, I hope it's been wonderful for people who've been watching it. This has been very beneficial for me as a new person to the city. Thanks so much. And I'll throw it back to you, John Beatty.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for your leadership, for raising these issues, for continuing to raise these issues. Ismaila, you know, thank you, you know, for, you know, being with us here today to raise it, but also in all your work, how you raise these. You know, the key terms that stuck out to me here was will, and how do we create the will? Because clearly we have smart, strong leaders here. We have people in communities who care deeply about building, you know, healthy, nourishing communities. But what I'm worried about is, how do we create the will and that civic muscle? How do we build that civic muscle? Because people get discouraged. And I don't blame people for getting this. It is discouraging for many folks. But if their response is to turn away, then we let our leaders off the hook. The response really has to be to engage and to force them, because they're not going to have the will to make these changes on their own. They're going to have to be compelled to make these changes that we're discussing here today. So thank you, for raising that so well, so powerfully here today, and joining us. And thanks everyone who was on this conversation. We will be sharing this out because it's not just about next week and the election. Definitely vote. If you're frustrated and angry, vote. If you don't feel things are going your way, vote. And bring your friends, bring your family, walk down with everybody on your block, and participate, and then tell the people who you elected, or tell the people who got elected what you think and why you voted. And that's the way we're going to have to build it up to create that will and use our civic muscle. So thank you for that. I will see everybody at the polls next week. And onward after that, we will talk about, how we come together and do all these things of participatory budgeting and civic muscle building. So it's a really honor to be here with all of you. And thanks everyone for joining. Be well.